And they understood, I think, in Germany, they also understood, like if you walk around Germany, you're going to see, the stumbling stones. You can't go anywhere without being aware of this history. Well, we had slavery in this country for hundreds of years, and we have monuments to the white people that supported that. It's a strange thing that we have in America. We don't want to acknowledge that narrative. It's like our narrative is like, well, we had the original sin of slavery, but then Abe Lincoln fixed all that. And then, 100 years of some strife here and there. But then Martin Luther King came along and we did, well, what about that 100 years in the middle? Why aren't we talking about that? And it's because we don't want to assess it because it's so painful to our narrative as this, bright and shining light on the hill. But, it's not true. We're not acknowledging the past. How are we going to get past that if we don't acknowledge it? And, we see the same mistakes being made over and over because there's no truth and reconciliation that's organized.
That's Gilbert King, a journalist and author of 2 award-winning books on civil rights and the host of the podcast Bone Valley. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. This episode is from a live discussion with listeners who are members of our Patreon and a continuation of the interview I had with the author, journalist, and historian Gilbert King. If you have any interest in joining us for these conversations, you can join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. Gilbert is well known right now for his work and that of his producer, Kelsey Decker, on the award-winning podcast Bone Valley, which explores the questionable conviction of Leo Schofield Jr., who was released from prison earlier this year after spending 35 years incarcerated for the murder of his wife, Michelle. But Gilbert is also the 2013 Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, and the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America, Beneath the Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, injustice lost and found, and the execution of Willie Francis, race, murder, and the search for justice in the American South. In this episode, Gilbert and I continue our conversation from last week and take listeners' questions on race in the pre-civil rights era of the American South, the difficulties we have as Americans with seeing our own history truthfully or clearly, the links between the investigation into the case of Leo Schofield Jr. and his other works, the cost of mass incarceration, and a wide variety of other topics. Hi, y'all. How are you guys doing? Looks like we've got lots of people doing good, which sounds great. So, guys, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. And I think most of you guys know Gilbert King. You know how excited I am to have him on. Gilbert is an amateur historian. I also say a journalist, but he's had 2 award-winning books on civil rights. He's the host of the podcast Bone Valley. Gilbert won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction for his book, Devil in the Grove, which is about Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and sort of Lake County, Florida. That book tells the story of Jim Crow era Central Florida in the 1940s, 1950s. And it's a point where citrus barons, a lot like the cotton plantation owners, were becoming rich off the backs of cheap Black labor. In that story, Gilbert walks us through the story of 4 young Black men who were accused of an assault on a young white couple. By the end of the day, after that alleged assault happened, the Klan swept into town, burning homes of Black families, chasing hundreds of them away into a nearby swamp. And one of the key characters in that story was future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was a young NAACP lawyer who was on what I would consider sort of a near suicidal mission of going down there to fight the Klan and try to find justice for the boys. That led to another book by Gilbert, where he explored Lake County again, and another race-related one. He also wrote The Execution of Willie Francis, which Willie Francis was a Louisiana 16-year-old who was arrested for murdering he was accused of murdering his former boss. Willie was electrocuted in the electric chair unsuccessfully, and it eventually led to a Supreme Court case, and he was executed later. In Gilbert's work, he found evidence of sort of questionable confessions, the potential that the pharmacist who had been Willie's boss may have been sexually abusing boys, all sorts of things that weren't known then that eventually led to sort of a new look at these cases. In the Groveland example, Gilbert's work directly led to the exoneration in 2021 of the 4 Black men. Most of you guys know him more recently for his work on Bone Valley, where Gilbert and his very talented producer, so when you're listening, Kelsey, I'm talking about you, Kelsey Decker. We're going to have to drag her on at some point.
Yeah, I will, Jason. I'm going to do it.
We'll find a way. At least we can start with coffee.
Yeah.
Right. I'll work her like any other source.
Exactly. We'll get her.
Yeah. So in Bone Valley, Gilbert and Kelsey explored the case of Leo Schofield Jr., who was convicted about 35 years ago in the death of his wife, Michelle, and who was recently given parole in his case. The work on Bone Valley raised serious questions about actual innocence for Leo. Gilbert grew up he lives in Brooklyn now, but he grew up in Rockville Center, New York, and also Schenectady, New York. He attended school at the University of South Florida in Tampa. Before heading back to New York City, I can relate to the leaving before you have your degree thing.
Oh, yeah.
But Gilbert's also done a lot of other cool things that you guys may not know about. In addition to publishing his books, he was a photographer. His work has appeared in Modern Bride, Jane, Glamour. He even did work for the fashion houses. His writings appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post. He's ghostwritten a couple books, worked on some coffee books. So for all of you listeners who are joining us, he can answer any question about anything. So Gilbert, I was going to go ahead and turn it over to you is there anything I left out?
No, not really. I mean, you covered it. It's a weird career, photography, ghostwriting. I was doing coffee table books for a while where I was photographing them and then started to write some of them. And at one point, I guess they were doing pretty well for the publisher. And the publisher said, you know what, these are doing well. We want to keep going with these. But we want to bring in a really good photographer next time. But you can still write them. And that was like the writing on the wall for me. Like, I guess I'm a better writer than I am a photographer. So it was like right around then I stopped taking any professional pictures. But yeah, that transitioned over to editorial work and did some ghostwriting. And then I had a publisher say, hey, you're doing great with us. You're spelling all your words right. You're meeting all your deadlines. Do you want to maybe do any ideas of your own? And I said the one thing that you're not supposed to say. I said, no, I don't have any ideas. And they're like, come up with one. And so I said, all right, I'll try and think of that. Took a long time. But that was when I found the story about Willie Francis, and that led to the execution of Willie Francis. And I just thought that was so fascinating that like this kid had survived his own execution. And the reason he survived it is because his executioners were a prison guard and an inmate who got drunk and it was a traveling electric chair. Horrible. It's like such Southern Gothic material, right? And they would just go around from parish to parish executing people and then bring the chair back to Angola. But this case always just really fascinated me. And I went down to Louisiana and started asking around with some of the older people and found out like Oh yeah, the official version is not true. There's another whole another story to that. And so that was really what that story was about, just looking at the, trying to solve the crime for one thing and really find out what really happened. But then it led to something that was, even more Southern Gothic, I think, and just more tragic, that this pharmacist was abusing young boys in this area. And one I found this out later after I'd written the book. One of the boys was the son of the sheriff,
Oh,
or
wow.
the sheriff's deputy. And guess whose gun was found at the scene where Andrew Thomas? It was the sheriff's
Let me
deputy's
guess, the
gun,
sheriff's deputy's gun.
right? And
Wow.
so there was a lot of that, and I had a lot of things confirmed through family members that told me some things that they had never told anybody before, exactly what was happening. So, now the case looks very different. You wonder, well, why doesn't that come out at trial? Like, you get a court-appointed attorney who's a white community member. He's not going to be attacking this story. It's a very Catholic community. They swept all that under the rug, and they just made it about a basic robbery gone wrong. But that was not true.
Yeah, one of the things we were talking about before that I think people would be interested in. I had asked you, how does a white kid from Rockville Center, New York, and Schenectady end up interested in what I would call the civil rights issues that existed in sort of really from the end of the Civil War to the 1950s. How did it ever catch your curiosity? How did you?
I don't know if there's a specific thing that caught my attention, but there was just this theme of, like, for some reason, as a very young person, I was really reading about wrongful convictions, but I was reading adventures like Count of Monte Cristo, Papillon. So they're like, all right, yeah, he might not have done the crime, but now he has to escape Devil's Island. And as a kid, that stuff really fascinated me, the adventure side of it. And I think it's always stayed with me, and using crime as a narrative to tell a larger story. And it really came about because I was reading this history and trying to look into this, these stories, and finding out what was happening. I was like, why don't I know this? I should be knowing this. And I just felt really ignorant that I didn't know this part of American history. And it was just really fascinating because it was so corrupt and so, imbibed with this racial terror. And just to see the way the media covered it, and the way it was just sort of not talked about in these communities. I always felt there's stories there that need to be told, and there's dark secrets. There's a lot of shame. And I just really thought that if I could go into some of these stories and just find out what really happened in these cases, that would be, a worthwhile adventure, I guess, of my own. And it really was that. I would look into these stories and draw up these really elaborate proposals. I would do my book proposals were like 75, 80 pages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, really, really extensive. And I just did that because I wanted to make sure that I had the story. I knew it was there, and I didn't want to get into halfway and go, oh, this story collapses on me. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. There's holes that I don't know about. And so I really did a lot of, I did my diligence. Even though I didn't graduate from my college, I came 2 math credits short, and I just left. I was like, I'm out of here.
Done.
Yeah. But I feel like I earned more than a PhD over the last 20 years doing the research that I've done. So I feel like, yeah, maybe I didn't get all of it in school, but I've done it since. And, I because of this journey, I've met so many like academics, professors, legal scholars that, I can call them up if I'm working on something and say, can you explain this to me? And it's a continuing education for me. And that is really, as a curious person, that really is what fires me up.
One of the things that you mentioned, like that idea of going down there and telling these important stories that, we don't talk about anymore. You and I talked about how the idea of, I think I described it as, if you look at the Civil War to the 1950s, it's almost like someone took a magic eraser and just sort of like softened out the reality of it. And we were talking about that idea, and I was giving you some examples from my family history about how we don't talk. My dad will talk about how they had to be snuck into the doctor's office or the water fountains or some of the protests, but they won't really talk about some of the terror that actually happened. So how, in thinking about both, let's say, the Black families who may have been terrorized and the white families who may have either also been terrorized or a part of the terror. Just given that we don't like to talk about these things, how do you get people to open up and share their stories?
I the only way I can think of is I just put in the time and I don't press. I never feel like I got to get this from you Thursday because I have a deadline. I don't really have deadlines. And so I can sort of work and stay in the area and just be in their lives a lot of ways and just take what they'll give me. But I think over time they start trusting you and you become part of their lives. And I think when they come home after a day of telling me these stories, they're really excited about it and they want to know more. And so like sometimes they can ask me questions and I can say, oh, here's what I know. Your relative did this, went to the war, and they don't know any of this stuff because nobody talked about it. And so it's really rewarding for them as well. I remember that like these are the kind of stories, Jason, that I'll tell you that really made an impact on me. When I was in Louisiana working on the Willie Francis case, someone introduced me to an older man. His name was Nolan Cabby Charles. And he was also the justice of the peace. I think he also drove a cab in town, but he was just like a fixture and grew up. And he was friends with Willie as a kid, and so he could really help fill in a lot of the details of what it was like to live as a Black person in this community. He really could answer a lot of questions. And I remember one time he again put me in his pickup truck and drove me to an old, one of those general stores. What kind of stores? Company stores, basically.
Company store,
right?
Yep.
And he drove me to, obviously it was all abandoned and everything like that. But he was explaining like how they worked, and I kind of knew already how they worked, but he was telling me stories that were so mind blowing to me, and he just rattled them off very casually. And one of the stories that he told me was that he would go with his sister to the store. They would wait till all the white customers left and they went to a back window and they could buy some things. And I remember their parents were sharecroppers, probably slaves themselves as children. That's how long ago we're talking about. If not, it was, their parents.
Pretty close, right?
Right. But he told me this interesting thing. There was a man who sort of ran the company store, and he was like the plantation boss, basically, which, shouldn't really exist, but it was sharecropping. It still ran like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they said there was the father was having some kind of money dispute. And the man called both of the parents to the company store while Cabby was watching this. He saw this whole thing unfold. And the father started to express his, beef about money and payment. And the man at the company store just wound up and just slapped him so hard to the ground and just basically said, I do not talk to you about finance. I talk to your wife. And it was a way of just emasculating him in front of his children that just set this pattern of oppression. And so by emasculating him and leaving him on the ground and talking to the woman about the finances, what was that really doing?
And also knowing that he could not strike back.
Absolutely not. That was not going to happen. And that could lead to his death. I mean, that was like something that was so terrifying. And so you had to take this. And I remember another woman telling me this story about how like, I don't even know, like these paramour relationships. I don't even know how to describe them, but a white person, a powerful white person could show up at your house if you were Black and basically send the husband out to the porch and go in and have sex with the wife. And that was like something that you could just do because you were a sheriff or a deputy and nobody was going to say anything. And so the husband would just be sent out to the porch. The man would go in and have sex with the wife, and that was accepted. And that was something that you had to learn to live with. And it was those kind of stories that these people were telling me that just like, I had no idea about these stories. And just like the daily oppression that, doesn't make it into the textbooks. We see those water fountain shots. That's what we think, oh, that was horrible. They had separate water fountains. That's not the real story. The real story is the things we don't want to talk about.
Yep. Yeah. And I don't think it's just the white families. I was mentioning to you, like my grandparents never talked about why they wouldn't vote long after they won the right to vote, what they were afraid of. And, my cousins, when I was growing up, saying that the the one thing you don't want to do is offend the pride of a white man. Or, you know, I told you the story, which I've probably told on the podcast. I don't know if I have, but of being at my grandmother's funeral and finding out at my grandmother's funeral, because my distant cousin said, you guys aren't really Blairs or Gilcrests, finding out the story of how my father's family, after my grandfather's brother was lynched, hid and ran across the, you know, state. But those are not stories that were passed on. But I think of the impact of those stories, right? A family that had started to build its wealth and had houses, ran across the state and gave everything up, and all those things get passed on through generations, right? The scars get passed on. And I think there's a beauty in truth, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said that. Someone said truth is beauty and beauty in truth. And I think getting those truths out there, you know, even just hearing that story, and this is where I was headed with it, hearing that story from my father's family, you know, it clicked in my head. Like, in my father's family, they do not talk about their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my mom died last year, and yesterday was Mother's Day. And the text thread between my brother and I is me saying, I know I don't need to say anything, but I hope you're well. My brother saying likewise. My dad saying something like, I went to church today. Same to you. We don't talk about our feelings. Well,
right.
You know, when you understand that history and you understand that their house burned down at some point and the nieces were killed, and that attitude of this shall pass, like the economic wealth, the emotional health, all these things, all this damage, it just strikes me that we're at a time where you've got the Florida governor, not to make it political, but who wants to remove from textbooks anything that would make people feel guilty, right?
Yeah.
You've got, but I sort of feel like your work shows, including your work on Leo, because I think it's also connected to this legacy.
Yeah.
It shows that these things are relevant today, not just because we need to know our history not to repeat it, but because they're literally affecting people today.
Yeah. You know, and that was one of the things I really wasn't really prepared for, because, you know, usually, you know, when I work on these books about history, I'm going back so far that, you know, everybody's passed away. So I rarely get a chance to actually interview somebody who is directly involved in the story. It's probably like their son, daughter, or, you know, something like that. But, you know, just knowing that these stories are, you know, out there, the silence is just strange to me. But it's also a thing that, I'll tell you another story that just one of those things that just really affected me, kind of like the Nolan Cabby Charles story when he's telling me the story about his father being smacked. So I became friendly with a man named A.P. Thoreau Jr., whose father was a major civil rights attorney and worked with Thurgood Marshall a lot in New Orleans. And he was a Creole man, a very light-skinned Creole man who could pass. And so he used the fact that he could pass to investigate lynchings. And he would, you know, show up in bars, and they would, you know, he'd say, hey, what happened here last night? And they would tell him everything. And he's working for the NAACP. He's putting himself in real danger, but he could pass. So they'd be just like, well, you're white. You must relate to this. I could tell you. And, you know, they would show him like lynching souvenirs, you know, like the chopped off fingers or the photographs of the body and, you know, all that stuff. And they're trying to sell it. And he would do this. And, you know, he became a very prominent civil rights attorney in Louisiana. But his son was telling me a story that, you know, all of the children were very light skinned and could pass. And so, you know, he said they would go on vacations and just be driving. They'd have to time their driving, like drive at night so they could get to a hotel at this particular time. There's not too many hotels that took Black people. So they had to really map out their journeys. You sort of see it in the Green Book.
They had books. My dad had, still had a Green Book.
Yeah. And so he told me we would go through towns in the daylight, and like, you know, the father would just say, okay, dark children, you get down, because they didn't want him to see Black children in the car, so that the lighter skinned children could sit up. But then he told me the story. The son told me the story that they had three sisters, And all three of them were very light skinned. And just one time they were like in their early, maybe teenagers or early 20s. They all just decided that they were going to live their lives as white people. And so they just moved out of the city, married white people, and just, never came back. And they said, well, once in a while they would come back, but it would be in the cover of night. They'd have to pull right into the garage. And I just thought about that. Like, here's this prominent civil rights attorney who's dedicated his life to improving the lives of Black people in the community. And he's got three daughters who just, I don't want anything to do with that. Like, that's no way to live. And they, it must have been so painful to be who he was and to have that happen to him. And that's just how complicated life is, especially in Louisiana.
Yeah. No, my mom's side of the family will tell you same stories, even among her siblings. Half of them, more than half of them, are very, very light skinned. She has one uncle that you can't tell, and his children all seem white. But I have a darker skinned aunt, and she was so subconscious of it. And, she once told me that she prayed that her children would be light. So they didn't have to live in that world. And so carrying all that shame and all of those other pieces. So I wanted to ask you one question that came from a listener. And it was, one thing that they would like to know is, when you were researching Devil in the Grove, what was the most surprising or shocking thing that you learned? And then I think they kind of double-barreled it with a question about Leo, which may give us an opportunity to kind of talk about some of the connections.
Sure.
What was the most sort of interesting evidence that sort of indicated his innocence? And the reason why I say I sort of feel like they're linked to some extent, some of the problems that you point out in Leo's case with the judicial system very much exists because we built a post-Civil War judicial system that was very focused on incarceration. So, but let me turn it to you. Most surprising thing in Devil in a Grove and
yeah. I mean, the thing that's most surprising to me and most shocking in Devil in the Grove, and there's a lot of it. I think that book makes a lot of people angry when they read it, because I think they're being shocked by things that the worst incident I came across was, if you haven't read the book, I'll just sort of tell you it's an important part. So after the Supreme Court overturns the convictions of the Groveland boys, the sheriff says, "Oh, okay, there's going to be a retrial. I'll drive up to Rayford State Prison, pick up the inmates, and I'll bring them back for the trial." And he does that, and he takes them down a side road and shoots them. And miraculously, one of them survives and is able to tell this story. I think if he would have died like he should have, there's no book. The Devil in the Grove is never written. We're never going to know this story. But the fact that he survived and was able to create an alternate story that had forensic evidence was really powerful. It's almost like having a cell phone at the time, I guess you'd say. So the sheriff shoots one of the suspects twice, and the guy, Walter Irvin, just lays there playing dead because he's handcuffed to his best friend, who's also been shot and killed. And he can't run anywhere because he's handcuffed. So he just lays there and just pretends to be dead. And then Willis McCall's deputy comes back and shines a flashlight over him, fires one more time through his neck because he sees that he's still alive. And that doesn't kill him. And so he lays there and he hears the sheriff say, "We got to make this look like an escape." And they start tearing at his clothes, making it look like there was a struggle. They pull some of his hair out, put it in the Sam Shepard's hand as if like he'd done that.
To make it seem like.
Yeah. And so after he survives this, he's in the hospital. Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers go in to see him. The FBI goes in, and they're all in this hospital room. And he starts telling the story about what happened to him the night before. And the FBI, they're no dummies. They realize, well, we got 5 bullets from the bodies, but there's a 6th bullet that we don't have. And that's the one that went clean through the neck of Walter Irvin. And so if the sheriff is telling the truth that, these guys were advancing on him and he emptied his gun, you're never going to find that bullet because it went right through the neck. Right. They know it just didn't lodge there. It went right through. But if Walter Irvin's telling the truth that he was shot on the ground there by the deputy, there's an idea where that bullet might be. And so they rush back to the crime scene from the night before, and they see that blood stain right there on the soil. And they start digging, and 10 inches below the soil surface, they find a 38 caliber bullet, which both of these men were like, what are the odds of that, right? In that one spot. So now you have perjury committed by, and also murder and attempted murder. These are, these are forensic, backed up by forensics now. The FBI wrote a damning letter to the U.S. attorney in Tampa by the name of Herbert Phillips, who was a known segregationist, appointed by, Herbert Hoover. And he basically just quashed this investigation. And it died there. And it's a U.S. attorney who killed it. And he's a white supremacist. And so you could look at a sheriff like Willis McCall and think, wow, this is, just a bad apple who's just creating all this terror. A guy like that does not exist unless people at higher levels have his back at every stage. The prosecutor, the judges, the U.S. attorneys, even the governor, they were supporting this. And so when I filed a Freedom of Information Act request, I was the first person to see these files. They'd never been opened before. Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers never saw them before. They never saw these reports. It was just buried. And one of the FBI agents even wrote in one of his reports, he said, he was angered about this being quashed. And, he said he was told that it was quashed for 4 words: tranquility of the South. In other words, if people really knew what was happening, they would riot in the streets or worse. But these were the kind of things that you were able to put a lid on. And, there's no protesting back in the day. It's just like, yep, that's law enforcement, the judge, everybody's got their back. And so that to me was the most shocking thing, like how endemic this was at every level of the government, right up until the governor. They were all in on this together. And you can't fight back against that.
It reminds me of the kind of takes it off the question, but it reminds me of the conversation we were having about, going back to also your first answer, the books, where you would open up the books and you would see the pictures of the white fountain, the black fountain, the black balcony, the white balcony. It's such a pretty version of what was really happening. And you and I were talking about the idea of all these lynching photos we've seen with like the smiling white kids and their Sunday best, certainly not evil on their part, and how Thurgood Marshall was afraid that was going to be his future. He was going to die looking at a bunch of kids in their Sunday dressed up in their Sunday best. But we also talked about the idea that in many instances where lynchings were happening, the sheriffs were actually trying to protect the people. And I was telling you how that was a shocking moment for me. It was just a shocking moment because it told me they knew it was wrong then. And they knew what was happening. And it really causes me to rethink my belief sometimes that people are just a product of their times. Like if they felt like they had to hide it, if they felt like they had to suppress it for the tranquility of the South, then inherently, there's something wrong with it.
Right. Right. And you can see like, in the families, like they didn't want to talk about it. You just mentioned that thing about, Mother's Day and just, these really just surfacey kind of greetings, like, I'm doing okay. How are you? Good. Moving on. And that's what it was like back then, because honestly, like what would happen if you brought up, hey, whatever happened to our, relative Sam Shepard? Like whatever happened to him? Well, the sheriff killed him. And you have to explain that to your children. Like, well, how did that happen? Yeah. Nobody wants to talk about that. Like every one of the Groveland families told me like that they never learned anything from their family members about this because no one would talk about it. And it's just obviously it was wrong. I would hear stories from one of Willis McCall's deputies who was still alive when I was working on this story. And, he came up to me and, he had like his cowboy hat on. He looked like, he fit like central casting kind of thing. Came up to me at a book talk and he said, yeah, you got your book right. Cause I was there. I lived it. That's the way it went down. And he said, but there's some things you don't know. And I became friendly with him and I would meet him and have breakfast with him all the time. And he would tell me stories and it was an education that I'll never forget. But he said, the sheriff was basically psychotic. He said he would just have a bottle of whiskey between his legs. He'd be driving out at night around the county. If he saw a black person on the side of the road and he felt like it, he'd just take the wheel and go, whoop, and run him over. And you'd see the newspaper report, a man killed in traffic mishap. And the deputy said, yeah, all I did was like write these reports clearing him, saying slippery road conditions. The man was in the middle of the road. He said, oh, that's all we did was just write these reports that made the stories go away. But he said he did it all the time. He was killing people. There's estimates that he killed dozens of people single-handedly by himself. And I mean, my research found that. I mean, I found other people that he'd killed, and the official story was just garbage.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of these kind of stories that just really, I think they're educational and they're really important for people to know, especially now, because when you have these stories about, unarmed Black men being shot, and you have video footage of it now, and like still not everything leads to a conviction. Sometimes you get, the grand juries are just not sympathetic to that. And like, well, he's feared for his life. He was a savage, big, large Black man, that those kind of stories get told. And I had a split second between me and, that still lingers today. I found one case. I'll just briefly tell you this one. It was in Louisiana. And so this young man, he was a young Black man, lived in a part of town. And next thing you know, a deputy shows up at his house at night. And the father answers the door and he says, I need to talk to Thadel. That was his name. And father brings down Thadel, and Thadel goes out and walks out into the darkness with the deputy who wants to talk to him. And the next thing the father hears is a gunshot. And he goes running out there. And what does he find? Son dead on the ground. And what happened? He tried to jump me. And the father's like, had no what do you, nothing. And that thing, it led to an FBI investigation that went absolutely nowhere, except it didn't go nowhere because some of the neighbors said, well, Tatel was stepping out with that deputy's white daughter. That's what happened. That was an execution. And so, you look at these lynching statistics, there's a very strict definition of lynching. It has to be 2 or more people taking the law into their own hands, societal mores, that kind of thing. Not a lot of these kind of things that happen to me, they're just, racial murders, racial terrorism. Right. It doesn't fit the lynching numbers. So the lynching numbers don't tell the whole story of what's
it has this like echoing effect that goes beyond that. Jill, who's in the chat, she's from Louisiana herself. She made a comment that kind of caught my attention. Not a question, but I'm going to turn it into one. She mentioned that poor white people were treated badly in her community for great grandparents. And one of the things that I've learned over time in studying the history of the United States and the South is that it was very intentional and deliberate to pit poor white people against Black people, because those two groups combined, outnumbered the population of well-off whites. And it kind of makes me think of the chair that Leo Schofield has been sitting in, the system that he's been sitting in. We have a system for all of its strengths that once you get past conviction, it's very hard to overturn a conviction. It is designed to keep you in. We talked about the idea of how, every time you go to the next appeal, you can't bring evidence from the previous appeal, that it takes time for people to open up and tell the truth, that it's a system that was designed to keep people in, right?
Yes.
Further. And I think while sort of Black Americans live with the legacy of it, I think white Americans, Native Americans, any poor American in particular, somebody who can't afford the best lawyers, lives with the legacy of this. Did you, in your mind, see a connection between some of the work you did in your other books and Leo's case?
Yeah, I really did, especially like in this particular section of Polk County, like the Cumbie area, in those areas around there. We were doing all this investigation and going back and finding people. And, one of the things we found is like a lot of the, women that we were interviewing who are like in their 50s now, they had their first babies at like 13 or 14. And, the description of how they lived and just, being really poor and living in these poor white communities, the system that was, I think, built after Reconstruction, the mass incarceration, this finality of it to like lock people up with these draconian sentences. I think, when we want that system, well, it's going to affect everybody. And I often talk about like the cost of white supremacy. Thurgood Marshall used to talk about it all the time. In order for white supremacy to function, it's going to compromise a lot of white people. And you better be on the side of the sheriff and law enforcement and not be thinking of your own morals and the right thing to do, because you can face serious danger by opposing this. And so you're almost forced into this role to support the white supremacy. And that white supremacy might be, we need you to perjure yourself to create a narrative to lock this man up. And you're not going to say no to the police and the sheriff. The sheriff in the town is the most powerful person in the county. And he's obviously has a reputation for violence. And I'm using this one, Lake County, Florida, as the example, but this is endemic throughout the Jim Crow South. The sheriff is often the most powerful person. And you're not going to go against him and his deputies. They can make life miserable for you, your businesses. And you see that over and over, like people getting threatened to do the right thing by getting up there and say what you saw. And I think that is the thing that compromises all of us. Trying to support this system of white supremacy. It has its costs. And I remember doing these talks, down in Lake County and, talking about, the racial terror and all that. And white people would just raise their hand up and say, it was terrifying for us. We went through that too. And they weren't wrong. Like if you didn't go along with this, you were going to face the wrath the same way Black people would in these towns.
Well, an example you gave me was the worker fight laws that were often used to, and you can walk through how they worked, but my understanding is from what you had said that, you could work 6 days a week. The sheriff was empowered on your 7th day, if you were sitting and loitering, to arrest you, put you in jail, and actually put you to work doing things, or fines. You would have to pay fines. And I could see how a law like that could be used against Blacks in a community, but there's going to be, the sheriff is not going to, I imagine, say, hey, I'm going to just use this against Blacks. I'm going to use this against that guy I don't like, my daughter's boyfriend that I don't like, the guy who isn't paying me kickbacks. That it ends up having a unfair system will create unfairness for almost everyone.
Yeah, that's absolutely what happened. The work of fight laws, the reason, like, it's just basically debt slavery. It's going back to debt slavery. It's like making people work off their fines. So they might get paid $2 an hour and the sheriff gets $4 an hour from that inmate. Until he pays off his fine to the sheriff, he's, stuck in jail for 2 weeks. And think about what that does to the families. Their breadwinner is now incarcerated. And the sheriff could just be really random about this, just pulling up to people he knows, going to their house, knowing they're not working, knowing they're not in the army, and just arresting them. And just that's what you could do with your power as sheriff. And it's not like today where you have public defenders and NAACP will come out and get wind of these things and start something. Back then, nothing happened. Nobody would stand up to anybody. And so it was just the way of life. And that is just, when I start reading about that and just the things that people were having to live through, it's just, that's a part of the American story that we never hear about because it's so uncomfortable. We don't want to know it.
So just thinking about the fact that so much of your work has to do with justice and injustice. And, I've been doing, I think, a lot of episodes really recently around all these sorts of issues for lots of communities. I got a listener question about how do you emotionally handle doing work that involves so many injustices that you either know about going in, that you're uncovering as you're pursuing it. They pointed out that Devil in the Grove is full of really inhumane acts, and the listener pointed out that they cried countless times while reading the book, felt frustration, anger over the corruption in the legal justice systems. And, she was thinking about the idea that you're spending years researching this and just what it felt like reading it you know, because you and I know there's so much that never makes it into the final product.
Oh
How
yeah.
emotionally did you deal with that?
It hits you, probably the same way it hits the readers. I'm just submerged in this and I just can't believe what I've just come across. That happens over and over in these stories. It's just a never ending flow of this kind of horribleness. And when you're in it, the only thing I'll say, the way I've gotten through it and not allowed it to really psychologically torment me to the extent that I think it could, um, is I use this analogy, like if you were going in for heart surgery and you had a really empathic, humane, sensitive surgeon who just started cutting and started crying and saying, "I love humans so much. I don't want that guy working on this. I want a guy who's going to be a mechanic or a carpenter and get in there and fix something." And sometimes I feel like that, like I have to detach myself from the emotions of this and just be the delivery vessel, be the messenger. I'm going to take this scene that I'm able to build from transcripts that's going to show, exactly what happened in this case and the unjustness of it and the, barbarism of it, and just convert it to a story that will have the kind of effect that I want it to have on people learning that. And so there's a detachment that takes place that makes it easier for me to like sort of say, the end goal is not me feeling it, it's others. Others need to feel this too. And how do I do that? And by taking this material, these stories and these lives and building a scene or something that creates the same kind of feeling I felt, that enables me to sort of have a little bit of a detachment from it. And also like the I don't want to say, it is very rewarding to do it effectively and say, I've been able to tell this one part of this trial in a way that's just not just facts and dryness and evidence, but in a way that, you see the human toll that this has taken.
Yes.
And you recognize the humanity in the people that this affects. And that's what I'm always trying to do.
Yeah, I remember this one time sitting in the bowl at the bottom of Ground Zero while it was still a bowl, and the Oklahoma City mayor had come on a visit. He was the one who was the mayor during the Oklahoma City bombing. His daughter was there. His wife was there. I think his daughter was like probably early high school, middle school. A captain from the New York Fire Department who had gone to Oklahoma City to help them when the bombing happened. He was there. And I wrote this story. It was only like 800 words, but it's definitely one of my favorite stories. And I remember a friend asking me, like, how do you live with that? And I was like, no, I live for it, to tell that truth, or to tell that story.
Right.
Like,
I totally relate to that, Jason. I mean, I that's a great answer too. I might steal that from you too.
Please feel free. Some things have happened that have created a scenario in which people are allowed to steal from me all the time, Gilbert.
Okay, good.
I love making it. Yeah, right. That's another good one, right?
It is.
No, but feel free. One of the other things that someone had asked was about how you write these stories. And I think there's like an emotional component to it. There is a voluminous amount of research that you're trying to organize. There's like the process elements of it. As somebody who, like writing a book, it can be so unbelievably difficult to sort of like organize it, structure it. I mean, and I think as a writer, knowing that it is very difficult to write when you're not feeling inspired to write. So what is your process like, organizationally, emotionally, the whole part?
Yeah. I think with me, I can look at it in a way that makes sense to me. And like every project I've done has roughly taken about 5 years. Even the Bone Valley podcast, that was 5 years of research and writing. And I think that's a luxury to have in this day and age, because everyone wants things fast. With Bone Valley, it was through the pandemic. I didn't really have a choice. I had to sort of like just keep going on it because I had nothing else to do and I couldn't travel down there. So I started finding other ways to do it. But everything has taken me 5 years. I would say 4 of those years in general has been research, like straight up research the whole time. And then I don't really start writing until like I have just about everything I need. and sometimes I'll have to go back and fill in some holes here and there, but for the most part, after 4 years, I've pretty much got what I need. And then it's I think 1 year of writing a book that's 100,000 words is pretty good. I don't know how fast it is, but it feels fast to me. And it's because I've done all this research and all this preparation. So I have really extensive outlines that are constantly changing. There's like pages and pages of lists on every chapter that I envision. And, a lot of it changes. An editor comes in and maybe makes a suggestion that's going to throw me back to work for a couple of months to figure things out. But for the most part, I really think that I figured things out by the end of those 4 years. And so because I've just done like way too much research. In fact, people kind of make fun of me because it's just too much. And some of these things I go off on these tangents that take, months to find out things that maybe lead to like 3 sentences in the book. And they laugh at me about it, but it's like,
I love it.
Yeah.
You got all your bases covered.
Yeah. And the truth of it
and it's
is
fun.
All that research kind of seeps its way into your book anyway. It's all, if you've done the research, it just gives you more authority that, you know your subject.
Or even color or the environment, or, I may go down a rabbit hole and find nothing, but find tons of nothing on the facts I'm looking for, but tons on the society, the culture, the feel of things. It's wild. That's what I say to editors and people who want to publish things. Don't get in the way of our process.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's a reason, you can't logically do this stuff. It has to be like, I feel like, we have, sometimes I go to these book festivals and, all the novelists get all the great questions. Like, what's your muse? They all process questions with nonfiction guys. Like, tell me the facts. What happened? Like they don't really ask the same questions, which is kind of good. I don't know if I'd want to answer muse questions or, like we call them, what side of the paper do you write on? Just, that kind of stuff. But again, I don't like the term creative nonfiction. I've always hated that for some reason, because people, people don't know what it means. They say, all right, so most of it's true. Like, no, that's a terrible phrase. So I like narrative nonfiction, but there's tons of choices to make as a writer and a storyteller in nonfiction. I'll give you an example. In Devil in the Grove, I have this scene that took me a long time to write. I couldn't figure it out. It's when the sheriff shot the 2 Groveland boys on the side of the road. And I couldn't figure out how I wanted to tell this, because there's the sheriff's version, there's Walter Irvin's version, and then there's the whole, truth of it. And so I ended up doing it kind of like a Rashomon scene. Like, you started out with the sheriff's version, and that seems very, shocking to you. Like, oh, why would they try to escape? They have Thurgood Marshall as the lawyer. That doesn't make sense. And then you hear Walter Irvin's story, and it just totally contradicts it. And there was just a way of doing that that's very emotional to experience it when you're reading. It kind of angers you. And but that's what I'm trying to do. And I want people to feel like, sometimes if I feel like you can't give them a happy ending, which in a lot of these kind of pre-civil rights stories, there's no happy endings, but you have to have something that's satisfying. And sometimes it's just going through the process and angering people so that they feel a certain way, or they have a certain respect for or understanding of the way things were. One of the best rewards I guess, it is right up there. I remember somebody that I knew told me that their father was not in the Klan, but very much an old school racist from, born in like early 1900s, that kind of thing. And this person gave her father Devil in the Grove, and he finished it, and she went over to him, and he was crying. And he just said, I had no idea. I had no idea. And I just thought he just learned something about human beings that he was not aware of before that. And like, if that could be you get the greatest award in the world, but to hear somebody say like, I had no idea, even if they're 90 years old and they're just a few years away from death, they've had some kind of awakening. And that to me is just so powerful.
So, in thinking about it, I've got a couple of really good questions here, but something, thinking about that almost Klansman or near Klansman reading it. And I always thought like, I've told people stories about like covering things like, I don't know, Sons of the Confederate Veterans or other things early in my career, and really loving and enjoying talking to those people. And I remember friends my northern friends would say, like, why would you love talking to them? And I always felt that, like my stories can help inform, educate, but even just having the conversation and two human beings bridging gaps between each other um, can be super powerful and healing for everyone involved. And I was just thinking about some of your work. It's probably been very healing for the families. And Marie brings up in your research, did you ever talk to the descendants of the bad actors? And if so, how was that, and what was the impact on them? We were talking about the idea of Governor DeSantis wanting to get certain things out of textbooks so people don't feel guilty.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether for some of the descendants of the bad actors in some of these situations, there's some healing, there's opportunity for healing for them too, if they're willing to confront.
Yeah, it's interesting. After Devil in the Grove came out and it started getting a lot of attention, I started to hear from people that kind of surprised me. People were friending me on Facebook, and I'm like, well, I recognize that name. It can't be. Like, why would they follow me? But I'll give you an example. Like in this Marie's question here, she talks about the descendants of Hunter, McCall, or any of the other bad actors. The grandson of the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, wrote me a letter only about 2 years ago. Wow. And, he said, I've been wanting to write you for a long time and wanting to talk to you because I have something I think you might want to know. And he said, when I was young, I think he was a lawyer himself in college or going to law school. He started hanging around the office where Jesse Hunter worked. And he was going through an old desk and he found a bunch of correspondence between the judge and his father. And in the correspondence, he said he clearly remembered that they were acknowledging that the Groveland boys were innocent, but that they had to go ahead with this trial anyway.
Wow.
So they knew.
Wow.
And yet they still went forward with this. And, he said, I went and asked my dad about it. And he said, my dad said, those letters are extremely dangerous. I would forget you even saw them. And I ended up telling that to the state attorney who was asking me for new evidence. And he ran over there and the next day interviewed the grandson because he wanted to get his hands on those letters to see if they might still exist, because he was working towards the exoneration and he thought that might have been rise to new evidence. He never could find those letters. But the grandson told him a lot of stories that made him believe it was true. It wasn't enough to help with the exoneration, but it just showed him that this was common. And that would not surprise me at all, to be honest with you. It would not surprise me at all. They weren't stupid.
Wow. So I've got another question from Marie too. And she asked a question I'm curious about. What did it feel like when they were exonerated, the Groveland boys? And did you ever expect that when you were writing the book?
No, I never expected anything like that. I honestly, I was just so happy that the book wasn't canceled, because I got orphaned in the early process. And I thought, oh man, I lost my editor. I don't know, maybe, some white guy writing about civil rights, like how valuable is that? I was terrified that it's just going to be canceled. Fortunately, it wasn't. But it didn't really do very well when it first came out. Like it just kind of didn't really get reviewed very much. And so it was kind of seen as just an unsuccessful book. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it wins the Pulitzer. And then, like that, just same book, right? But, that's how the world works, I guess. So I had low expectations about what a book could do or the effect of storytelling. I was just really I was hoping maybe I get to write another book, but I didn't have high hopes for it. So all my joy and really, all the rewarding parts of this story were just being involved with the families and being involved with the state attorney who he got a report dumped on his desk that said there's no path to exoneration, posthumous exoneration. We don't have any new evidence and we can't do it. And he would not let that rest. He called me up and he was like, we need new evidence. That's the only thing that's going to help here. And I would get in his truck. We would drive around to storage facilities looking for lost evidence and all that stuff. And he found it. He actually found the original trial evidence.
Wow.
And that's what actually led to the exonerations, because they found the pants that were held up in court saying, this is a semen stain from that man right there. We know that we've had this tested. And so that's proof of rape. Well, they were able to test that stain. It was not a human stain. And so he said
Wow.
that rises to new evidence. So that was the level of corruption from his predecessors. But when the exoneration happened, I invited Thurgood Marshall Jr. down, and he came down. He sat next to me and spent time with the families and talked about the connection and how the father believed that these families were his heroes because they were willing to fight and seek justice. And so just to be there with, the legacy of, Thurgood Marshall's son and the families, and hearing the words from the judge in Lake County that said, "It's my extreme honor to formally dismiss all charges against these four men." You heard people just gasping and crying in the courthouse, and just to be there, and I had the best hugs of my life. They're just, they just mean so much.
So another listener question that kind of ties into the point that you were making when you brought up Thurgood Marshall Jr. And I'm going to add my own, White House press conference, double barreling it to it. The question was, were you already familiar with Thurgood Marshall, or was that new territory for you for your research? And then I'm going to add to that question, what was the most surprising thing you found out about Thurgood Marshall?
Oh, yeah. Okay. The only thing I knew about Thurgood Marshall was probably like textbook 101 kind of history stuff. I knew he was kind of Mr. Civil Rights. I knew he like Brown versus Board. I knew he was he was a lawyer for the NAACP, and he would do these landmark cases, school cases, desegregation, housing, those kind of cases. And also he was the first Black Supreme Court justice. That's about all I knew. I did not know that he was traveling around the South taking death penalty cases by himself as sort of the last line of defense. I feel like he's like the
in places where civil rights lawyers had just been killed too.
There was nobody else, there was nobody. If you didn't have Thurgood Marshall, you were going to die. Basically, he was your last hope. And so like the whole point of like starting out the prologue of the book with, Black families just standing around ashes of homes that have been burned down, and family members in prison, and hearing these two words, Thurgood's coming. It was like so inspiring to them, so filled with hope. I think the thing that really surprised me most about Thurgood Marshall, and still surprised me today, and it really still informs my writing and my storytelling, was that he had this ethical compass on him, that even when his own lawyer, like he would not take a case unless they could prove that these guys were absolutely innocent, because he said, we can't afford setbacks. And there's so many of these cases, we have to take the ones that are going to lead to precedent and maybe change some laws at the Supreme Court. And so that was his goal. And at times, like I found like where even the lawyers would say, trying to cut a few corners, and he would not have it. And he just was still like, he would be offered all these speaking engagements. I would go through his correspondence, all these offers to speak and get paid for this stuff. And he says, I do not do anything but free speaking. And I just, in today's world, that's not what we see from the Supreme Court, right? To just see someone so like focused on like trying to preserve the integrity of his position as a Supreme Court justice. He's not cashing in on anything. He's not making any extra money here and there. And even in his days as an NAACP lawyer, he always did things by the book. He always insisted on everything being, as perfect as he could get that, because he said, I have no room as a Black lawyer. I'd open myself up to ridicule if I make a mistake. And so he was carrying this great burden of future Black lawyers by the way he behaved and carried himself in court. And, you read some of the transcripts, and, he had every reason to really like be just like done with American society and Jim Crow from the things that he'd seen and experienced. And yet he would always go in there and be very collegial with his opponents who were clearly racist, trying to, get racist sheriffs out of charges of murder and stuff like that. And he wouldn't like treat them differently. He would just treat them as lawyers. And it took a lot of them aback, and that they sort of decided to like, that they could talk to Thurgood Marshall and that they could carry on conversations and treat him equally in court. And you did see that develop. Like they would say really lovely things about Thurgood Marshall. Like, I just saw him in the hallway. We had a laugh and a half out there, Your Honor. And he's a very funny man. And, they would just compliment him. And he goes, I don't want to question his legal prowess because I know he's a much smarter lawyer than I am. They would say that in open court. And I think he had an effect on the people around him. And I think that was really surprising to me, the way he carried himself, not just ethically, but just as a human being, and not allow racial hatred to affect him in court.
I wonder if he could have ever imagined a Gilbert King coming along and telling that story and it leading to an exoneration. I wonder what he thought.
I can give you a hint on that because I saw
Okay.
correspondence. There's a Richard Kluger who wrote that great book about Brown versus Board.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
But he was corresponding with Thurgood and trying to get Thurgood to be interviewed. And Marshall was just like, nobody cares about me. I'm just, no one's going to care. My life is not that interesting. I'm like, Kluger's
I'm like, dude,
yeah,
you might be a smart judge, but you are not a judge of
exactly
what's interesting.
And he was so reluctant about it. Like, why is anybody going to care about this? And I'm like, wow.
Well, one of the things too, and I think of this in that case, but I also think of it in Leo Schofield's case. Like, what are the odds, right? Like, what are the odds that a judge, right? So, because you guys have a judge in that case who's an active judge, Judge Coop, who tells you, gives you his card and tells you about the case. That's already like the odds on that are astronomically low.
Yeah.
You then go to a dinner or drinks where there's a Polk County public defender who's like, yes, you should look into that case.
Yeah.
The fact that you were even able to get an interview with Jeremy Scott and that Kelsey was able to do such a gifted job of asking questions and then to like end up with that same judge back in the process again. Like, what are the odds of that? It's like what did that
I don't know.
At any point it felt like fate or
there's some elements that leap in here, and Leo's a very spiritual person, as is Judge Cupp, and some of the other people involved in this are very spiritual, and they see this all as like God's plan, and like this was all meant to happen. And I kind of can't argue with that. I mean, I'm not as spiritual as they are, but I think that the people coming together on this story were the right people at the right time. So I wouldn't argue with that, and that goes right to Kelsey too. I mean, honestly. The way she just rose and grew through the whole years that we were working on this to get where she was. We just finished a bonus episode about Leo's release. We didn't finish it. We just wrote it, and we're going to record it tomorrow. But to see like she's written this episode, she's taking total control over this episode. Because her confidence level is up here now.
Gone.
And I mean, I have to be really careful with it because she'll just like, we write on these documents that we share, these Google Docs, so we can see other writing and notes and stuff like that. And I'll write, some description and she'll just cross it out and like rejected. And she writes something else. I'm like, I think like I have a Pulitzer Prize and she's just wiping my shit right out. And I have no qualms.
Love it.
I do. I love it. I'm like,
I love it.
That's what I've always wanted you to do. Just do it. I trust you completely.
It's amazing to watch somebody grow like that.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. I mean, it just she's clearly like, she hates when I say this, and I was just going to say it once again, but she sort of became the conscience of Bone Valley. Like, I really think that she carried the mantle of this case in a way that I hate to say this too, but young people. When you look back at history and like the changes in civil rights, I think about that story where like the University of Texas is not allowing Black people. And so the young people in law school in white Texas in 1944 protest that there's not allowed, Black people are not allowed, and they join the NAACP in protest when Thurgood Marshall shows up. And they made such an impact. And you look at civil rights throughout, like it's young people carrying this. And so I feel like Kelsey had this pureness to her. Yeah. She's like, I see it this way. And, you think of, yeah, she's right. Like, that's the only way to see this. And so that kind of judgment was really valuable to me. I'm just having her.
Because it added that same kind of thing. One of the things that I was curious about in thinking about this, it's really easy as a Black American, I think, to like put myself in the victim bucket. Right. There are a lot of sort of like horrible things, though, over the course of our society that have happened to all sorts of people. Easy example is Native Americans. I was at the White House last week, last Friday. I was talking to the National Press
Oh, right,
Foundation,
right.
and I was at the White House, where I brought up Plum Valley, actually, um, as one of my examples of good
Okay.
journalism being done in new
Oh,
mediums. But I was there, and I'm looking at the White House, and I'm doing my normal like awe of this amazing thing, and I turn around and I'm like, Andrew Jackson. We have a statue to the man who is responsible for the Trail of Tears, who was an absolute monster. Um, but I'm willing to bet, right? Like if I walked around that Andrew Jackson statue, and I kid you not, people taking pictures of themselves with it, and I asked those people, what was Andrew Jackson? Maybe a handful would have told me, what was he responsible for? The expansion of the West, right?
mhm.
Or some small element like that. I feel like we as Americans are like gifted at whitewashing our history. And in no period did we whitewash our history more than between the Civil War and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. But
Yeah.
we're gifted at. Have you ever read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United
Mhm.
States? Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but we're gifted at it. And I feel like until and I think maybe we do it because we want to have this ideal of ourselves, but I think we can have this ideal of ourselves and whitewash our history, or we can actually be that ideal, right? But that's going to require no longer whitewashing our history. And if I, for example, believe that for 7, 9, 10 generations, the lynching of my relative or the taking of their wealth had a negative effect on me as an American, I also need to recognize that for 20, 25 generations, the behaviors of people like Andrew Jackson have had negative, like there needs to be a reckoning in my
Mhm.
mind. And I don't know how we get there without all of us looking at our history and taking responsibility, because people who aren't here, they're not there anymore.
Right.
But we live with the fruits of it, right?
Yeah. I was just thinking while you were speaking, I just thought of like reminded of a James Baldwin quote. It's from Notes of a Native Son. And it's sort of exactly what we're talking about right now. And the quote is, I'm going to read it to you. Neither whites nor blacks, for excellent reasons of their own, have the faintest desire to look back. But I think that the past is all that makes the present coherent. And further, that the past will remain horrible for exactly as long as we refuse to assess it honestly.
Mm.
And, it makes me think of like, the end of apartheid and these truth and reconciliation committees that basically, gave immunity to tell the story. So you're not going to be prosecuted, but we need to know the truth. And
Why was it's so important to tell the story?
right. And they understood, I think, in Germany, they also understood, like if you walk around Germany, you're going to see, the stumbling stones. You can't go anywhere without being aware of this history. Well, we had slavery in this country for hundreds of years, and we have monuments to the white people that supported
Yeah.
that. Uh, it's a strange thing that we have in America. We don't want to acknowledge that narrative. It's like our narrative is like, well, we had the original sin of slavery, but then Abe Lincoln fixed all that, and then 100 years of some strife here and there. But then Martin Luther King came along, and we did well. What about that 100 years in the middle? Why aren't we talking about that?
Yeah.
And it's because we don't want to assess it because it's so painful to our narrative as this, bright and shining light on the hill. But it's not true. We're not acknowledging the past. How are we going to get past that if we don't acknowledge it? And we see the same mistakes being made over and over because there's no truth and reconciliation.
Yeah, right. Because, people talk about things like reparations, like a good first step before we get to something like that, if we ever do, would just be truth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I mean, and it's like, I think Brian Stevens says, there's no reconciliation without truth. Like, the truth has to come first. Um, and like, we just don't have anything in place to do that. So it's really left to lawyers to become storytellers, journalists, authors, writers. They're the ones who are tasked with this. But wouldn't it be amazing if we had government money to come in and say, here's immunity, but we need to settle this. This is what's happened. Let's all acknowledge it. And instead, we have like, you know what, these books really make us feel really uncomfortable. Can we get them out of the classrooms?
Right.
Like,
right.
why are they
Right.
uncomfortable? Because we're white and it doesn't make us feel very good,
Yeah. The answer isn't it's wrong.
Right.
Right. It's
Right.
that it's uncomfortable. If you guys in the chat have any more questions, you can go ahead and ask questions. But one of the things that I was sort of curious about in thinking of your career, your trajectory, um, and kind of what's next for you. I was thinking about there's only one Gilbert King, and there's now maybe two. We have Kelsey and Gilbert King. Um, so we've got Kelsey and Gilbert, but you guys can't do everything.
Yeah.
What do you think other people can do with their different kinds of talents and skills, whether they're a writer or there are other topics for people to explore? Are there ways that they can use other skills that they have to have this kind of positive impact? And
absolutely. I have a really good answer for this. So after Devil in the Grove came out, it was being assigned in schools, especially in Florida, colleges mostly. And there was a young man by the name of Josh Venkataraman, who was, part Indian, part, I don't know what his other side of his family is, white anyway. But he grew up in South Florida, and he was at the University of Florida in a history class, and they were reading Devil in the Grove. And he was like, kind of like me, like, wow, I cannot believe this story happened. And on his way home from a holiday, he decided to drive through Lake County and drive through Groveland and some of the towns that were mentioned. And he just became really interested in it. I think he wrote me a letter asking me some questions. And then he went back home and he got his state representative. He said, this is wrong. I don't know how this is. These guys shouldn't be found guilty. They should be exonerated. And he got his own state representative down in Broward County, Fort Lauderdale, to sponsor a claims bill with another state representative.
Oh, wow.
And brought it to the House, and it passed unanimously. And the Groveland boys were pardoned, and Florida apologized, and it reopened the investigation, and ultimately they were exonerated. And this was a 20-year-old kid in a history class. I mean, wow. I wrote the story. Cool. I know that. But the story was out there for a couple of years. It wasn't until he started doing something. This 20-year-old kid took it on his own and made this happen. And so I'm a firm believer that not only anybody, but even young people who maybe haven't finished their educations yet, they can use that power and their energy to make a difference in some kind of way. And I kind of look at Kelsey in that light too, just somebody who just rises to the occasion and just, what she was able to bring to this story, it shaped me. I mean, it really did. It affected me. It changed the way I think about stories, just working alongside her. And so I just never underestimate what one person can really do. In anything.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So I have a Leo question.
Sure.
How's Leo doing today, and how can we help?
Okay. I'm going to answer that. I'm also going to go back because I realized one of the persons asked us two-part question. I didn't get to the second part. So I was about most
do you want to jump
evidence.
on the second part? Yes, the most interesting.
Oh, I'll do that first, and that one's on the screen, so I can come back to that.
Yep.
There was a lot of interesting moments, obviously, with Jeremy Scott and some of the revelations. But I think the thing that was the most interesting to me is that every time I saw some evidence that was like the most damaging to Leo that really wasn't there in the early parts of the investigation, the police didn't find it, police didn't tell him these things, the prosecutor, John Aguero, would take those people into his office away from the police
privately.
And suddenly the case changes. And, he did that with the most important witnesses in the trial. Alice Scott, the LaFoons gave this testimony that, it didn't match what they told police. And so it was sort of clearly being massaged in this office with no tape recordings, no witnesses. And suddenly this evidence was there. And then you realize, well, he did try to do this with Leo, trying to offer him a deal without his lawyer present. And then he did it with Jeremy, and he actually perjured himself on the stand. And it got to me to thinking, if the state is so confident in their case, why are they always lying? And why are they manufacturing this kind of evidence? That's so obvious to me. And so like, that's a really good tip off that the case is not strong. I can see the defense maybe bending the rules a little bit, or, that's sort of within the purview of a defense. You put an aggressive defense, but the prosecutor is not supposed to be winning convictions.
They're supposed to be a minister of justice.
Right.
A minister of justice.
Right. And many of them take oaths to this. But there's human factors like promotions and professionalism. Maybe you want to go on to be a judge. You don't want these black marks of bad convictions. And so you can see the steps that they take. There is no way on earth that the Jeremy Scott evidence about the fingerprints should have been investigated by the same prosecutor that convicted Leo Schofield, because any investigation that he does runs the risk of overturning it. One of his other.
And he certainly harmed the ability to use anything Jeremy Scott said by meeting with him privately.
Right.
So
absolutely.
Before we jump to how's Leo today and how can we help, can we jump to one of my favorite topics, Alice Scott?
Yes. Yeah.
How's Alice Scott?
Alice Scott, I try to get a hold of her. She, I don't think she will ever talk to anybody again. She already did enough damage the one time she did talk to a reporter like 20 years ago. And she just changed her testimony and started adding new things. And that was never said at trial. She was very unreliable. I don't really know what happened there. I know that at one point she was a confidential informant for that Polk County law enforcement. That makes its way into the case early on. But she clearly, her husband, Ricky, I talked to him and he would talk to me. He didn't want to talk to me on recording or an interview, but, he said, look, I stand by everything I've said. She was definitely someone very consistently changing stories and not very comfortable not telling the truth. And she would exaggerate a lot of things. She liked to be the center of focus. And, she definitely had some psychiatric issues and hospitalizations and medications. And so like, there's a lot of factors that led to
Were they aware of any of that at the time they were using her as a witness?
I think the state was. I just think that Leo's lawyer wasn't. And so he just didn't do any preparation.
Comes back to that point. Your job is to be a minister of justice, not to win the case. Right.
And there's like little things like this in the case that I saw, like, and it's not really the fault of the prosecutor, but, it is there. Like, so at one point, Leo goes home. This is what he says, according to Leo. He's out there searching for her the night Michelle disappears. It's 2:00 in the morning. And he calls Michelle's aunt and talks to her at 2:00 and says, I'm just trying to find out if Michelle's been there. We can't find her. She's missing, blah, blah. That 2:00 call could not have come from his house because they didn't have a trailer there. And so, or they didn't have a phone in the trailer. So it had to come from outside. And Leo at the time was at his parents' house, because they had to switch cars and everything. So 2:00 really made total sense that he made those calls, because that's when he said he was calling, the hospitals and everybody else. And then he went out to search again. But Leo's lawyer never found out about that 2:00 call because he didn't go through the police reports. And so he didn't know enough to ask it. And there's a moment in the trial where the prosecutor, John Aguero, is there. Jack Edmond is talking, the lawyer, and he mentions the name of Leo's aunt, Kathy Harris. And he mentions something about my next witness, Kathy Harris. He got that mixed up. He knew the name, but he couldn't remember what her relevance was to the case. And John Aguero says, no, Kathy Harris. Like, he just stops it right there in court. Like, she can't come up here. And says, you must be thinking of the wrong person, basically, which he was. He was thinking of some other name. But you could see John Aguero knew about who Kathy was. He knew that there was a 2:00 call that would seriously damage his timeline. And so you could see that he was like a little bit afraid that this would come up. And I saw it in his opening comments. He sort of made some remark that sort of insinuated that he was aware of this. But if the defense wasn't going to raise it, he was more than happy to move on. But he knew everything that was happening in this case.
Yeah. So before we do Marie's question, which we can jump back to, I have a Harry T. Moore question. And sure. Harry Moore he was a Black educator, pioneer in the civil rights movement. He died in Florida, I think, what was it, 1950 or 1951?
Right.
Before Marshall getting down there. And that's part of the reason why I called it a bit of a suicide mission for Marshall to take on the case. Kristen's asking, in your research, did you ever talk to anyone or discover anything that pointed strongly toward who was responsible for his death? I mean, we've got a lot of deaths in this story. We've got among the boys, the sheriff too, right?
Yeah.
This is the story where the sheriff gets blown up at the end.
Oh, that's the one in the Scottsboro boys. But
Scottsboro is the one I'm thinking of.
Sadly, Willis McCall served 28 years as sheriff. He didn't come out of office until he killed a black prisoner in his jail. Tried him for murder, but Harry T. Moore was really fascinating because nobody knows him. Really, Kristen, you're one of the very few, believe me. I give talks all the time, even in Florida, and people aren't aware of who he is. So he was the executive secretary of the NAACP in the state of Florida, basically the president of the NAACP. He was the most powerful person. And Thurgood Marshall had worked with him on school cases, segregation cases, things in the past. And he knew he was going back to this area of Central Florida. So he got Harry to sort of keep the pressure on Willis McCall. It was right in between the trials. And now after the shooting, the case kind of blew up, and Harry T. Moore was tasked with talking to the media. Marshall put him in charge of talking to the governor, politicians, and raising awareness about what Willis McCall was doing. And on Christmas Eve, right between the trials, the Ku Klux Klan put a bomb under his house, killing both him and his wife. So he became the first martyr of the modern civil rights movement, and nobody knows who he was. Later on, they reopened the case. The attorney general for Charlie Crist in Florida reopened the case, and they did another investigation. And I looked at it. I read the whole report. It wasn't absolutely conclusive, but they pointed to 4 men that they thought were involved in this, 4 Klansmen who had all since passed away. And so they thought that they were kind of like rogue Klansmen who, Willis McCall clearly wanted Harry T. Moore dead, but he was smart enough to stay away from it.
Sort of stay away from the bomb. And
Right. But like Harry T. Moore's wife at the very end, when they asked her who was responsible for this, right before she died, she said, everybody knows who was responsible for this. And she was clearly talking about Sheriff McCall.
That at the end of the day, no matter what, it's by negligence or by peace. So we'll go to Marie's question about our buddy Leo, and then we'll call it a wrap unless anybody else has anything they will want to go. So how is Leo today, and how can we help?
Leo is doing really well. I spent the day with him on Sunday, Mother's Day. I was down in Florida, and I ended up just hanging out with him and Chrissy. We went to church. I got to see Leo sing in the gospel choir. And then we went back to his house, his halfway house, and he played guitar, and we talked for a while and had lunch together. Mother's Day lunch, I guess you'd call it.
Nice.
He's doing really well.
What'd you guys have?
Leo's sister sent over lasagna, pizza, and salad. It was really good.
Choice.
Yeah, it was delicious. And Leo's getting set. I think he's in a halfway house that's eventually going to have 4 people. There's only 2 there right now. So they both have their own rooms. They have stocked refrigerators. Leo's gotten his driver's license. He's done all sorts of administration things. He's been passed his road test already.
Nice.
Yeah. And so he's adjusting. It's not going to be an easy adjustment. I know that once this kind of dies down, it's, he's going to probably have some moments where, he thinks about all the years that have passed and all that stuff. But overall, I'd say he's doing really well. He has a really good support system. If you want to help, he has a GoFundMe page that Chrissy put up. If you just Google GoFundMe and Leo Schofield, you'll find it. He needs a vehicle to go to his new job. And so that's, one of the things he's going to be doing. And but overall, I think he's doing really well. He's, practicing his music a lot. That's like the thing that he's always cared about. He didn't get a chance to play as much in prison as he would have liked. So he's really kind of making up for lost time here. But between his job and some of his other responsibilities with the church and volunteering, he's got a lot on his schedule.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and give that. And actually, now that you're talking, I'm like, that would be a really good idea for an episode, the transition for offenders back into regular life. So someone less famous than Leo, so we get more of a.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea.
I think that would be a good episode.
Absolutely.
But anyway, I was going to call it a wrap. What you guys in the chat don't know is I've had Gilbert since 7 p.m. Eastern time because we recorded an episode before we did this. Let's see, for those of us who pray, he and Chrissy, let's see, what kind of job has he been able to acquire is not the one I meant to click. Oh, for those of us who pray, he and Chrissy would benefit. Lots of thank yous in the chat for us for doing the episode and for you answering the questions. A lot of amens.
Yeah, you have a really beautiful audience. I'm looking at some of these comments. It's just so heartwarming to see. So thank you all for listening, because I really did appreciate it. The questions are fantastic. So thank you.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys soon for our next live. And follow what's next for Leo and the bonus episodes coming up on Bone Valley, and follow whatever, I'm sure, based on the comments you guys have made about all this work. Go back and read the stuff you haven't and follow what's coming next.
So nice, Jayson.
Of course.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. I could have done this all night,
I know.
I'm just getting warmed up. So,
right, yes, right. Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jayson Blair. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.